In the previous video, we looked at the dangers of having pepsin, the stomach's primary digestive enzyme that targets protein, active 100% of the time. The obvious danger being that if there was no food inside of the stomach, it was possible for pepsin to actually start digesting the protein that makes up the muscle in the stomach walls. To that end, in this video, we're going to talk about two additional ways that pepsin can actually be regulated and turned off when there is no protein-based food inside of the stomach, starting with this chemical here, which is a chemical called pepstatin. Now, anyone that knows the structure of protein will recognize that pepstatin has a very similar chemical structure to proteins in the food that pepsin is supposed to digest. However, the structure of pepstatin is distinct enough where it can actually fit into the active site of pepsin, meaning that it can get into here. However, because its structure is distinct enough from the proteins that pepsin naturally digests, it will fit into the active site, and then pepsin will not be able to do anything, meaning that as long as pepstatin has fit inside of the active site, any digestion by pepsin is thereby prevented. This is why we call the type of compound that pepstatin represents, we call it a competitive, if I can actually spell the word competitive properly, a competitive inhibitor. Meaning that because pepstatin has a similar structure to the proteins that pepsin digests, it actually competes with protein in order to fit in the active site, and because it physically obstructs pepsin's active site from being used, it thereby stops or inhibits pepsin from performing its normal function. So in addition to pepstatin, another type of inhibition that is used in order to prevent pepsin from digesting the walls of the stomach is a process that we call feedback inhibition, and here is how it works. As we know, pepsin is the primary digestive enzyme of the stomach and the primary digestive enzyme that breaks down proteins. And when pepsin does this, it doesn't actually break down the proteins into singular amino acids one at a time. It actually breaks them down into short 3 to 4 amino acid long fragments, which are what we call oligopeptides. And if we take a look at this name, if I can actually spell the word peptide properly, there we go. Oligo is actually a prefix that means few, and peptide is another word for amino acid, meaning that an oligopeptide is a few amino acids long chain that are the byproducts of when pepsin does its function in breaking down protein. So the more pepsin functions, the more protein it is able to break down, and the more short chains of amino acids, the more oligopeptides will be floating around the gastric juice inside of the stomach. Now, what these oligopeptides can actually do is the oligopeptides, when they get close to pepsin, will actually bind to a second active site located in a different location than the primary active site that targets protein for digestion. And when these oligopeptides attach to this secondary active site, it causes the folding on the surface of pepsin, what we call the conformation of pepsin, to change. And when the conformation of pepsin changes, the active site of pepsin actually closes, and therefore this causes pepsin to inactivate itself as long as there are large amounts of oligopeptides floating around, meaning that pepsin has been doing its job for a significant amount of time. This is what we call feedback inhibition, because the more pepsin is active, the more proteins it is able to break down, and the more short chains of amino acids will be floating around, which then act as feedback to tell pepsin that its job is mostly done in terms of breaking down proteins to their amino acid components, and therefore can bind to this secondary active site in order to shut the active site that it uses for protein digestion, and therefore effectively turn it off once its purpose has been fulfilled. So between the extra thick layer of walls in the stomach, especially the mucosal layer that prevents pepsin from being able to get at the muscle, this competitive inhibitor pepstatin, and a built-in feedback inhibition mechanism, most of the time your stomach is very good at regulating the activity of pepsin, but sometimes it is not enough, and sometimes due to unforeseen environmental conditions or complications involving medical conditions in the body, sometimes the stomach's defenses are not enough, and the combination of the very, very strong acid in the stomach, as well as one of the most powerful digestive enzymes in the body, can actually cut a hole into the wall of the stomach. And when this happens, this is what we call a gastric ulcer, or more commonly known as a stomach ulcer. And anyone with a gastric ulcer will routinely describe it as the most painful experience that they have ever had, and consequently I would not recommend trying to give yourself a gastric ulcer. Now, the good news is that you would really need to mistreat your digestive system in order to give yourself an ulcer, although there are a few medical conditions that can make the process a lot easier. Firstly, for those suffering from certain medical conditions that necessitate them taking anti-inflammatory drugs, if you're unfamiliar with what anti-inflammatory drugs are, any drug that is taken to reduce swelling after an infection or after a wound, drugs like aspirin or ibuprofen, are at risk of weakening their stomach's ability to protect themselves, because one of the side effects of anti-inflammatory medications is a decrease in mucus production, and we know that mucus is one of the primary defense layers that stops pepsin from being able to get through the wall of the stomach and attack the muscle in the stomach walls. Now, actually, the most common example of medical conditions that lead to an ulcer are bacterial infections, which are usually the result of a very specific type of bacteria called Helicobacter pylori. You don't need to remember this name because there's a case study right after this that you can go over. And Helicobacter pylori is a very nasty individual because, number one, it has evolved to be acid resistant, meaning that it can withstand the damage done by hydrochloric acid inside of the stomach long enough to be able to get to the walls. And once it makes it to the walls of the stomach, it actually releases enzymes that are able to cut through the mucus layer where it burrows into the wall of your stomach, reproduces, eventually killing a large number of cells in the wall of your stomach, thereby producing an ulcer. The good news is about Helicobacter pylori infections is that normally these occur because of eating contaminated food that contains this bacteria that wasn't killed properly during the cooking of food, and therefore it is relatively easy to prevent simply by proper food preparation. Now, usually these two conditions are exacerbated by poor eating habits, and usually both overeating but actually undereating as well can both contribute to the development of a gastric ulcer. Overeating is fairly obvious because the more we eat, the more HCl the stomach releases, and the more pepsin is produced by the stomach in order to digest the protein that is found within your food. And chronic overeating, keeping the stomach active for large amounts of time during the day, means that we are increasing the risk of acid doing damage to the mucus layer of the stomach, and pepsin eventually being able to get to the muscle and digest the proteins within the muscle layer of the stomach. Undereating is also a big problem because, as we previously mentioned, if there is no food in the stomach, pepsinogen and its active form pepsin will have nothing to digest. And one of the disadvantages even of undereating is eventually the body is going to get hungry and the brain is going to send signals to the stomach to start preparing it for food, to hopefully trigger a person that hasn't been eating for a while to start eating again. But if no food makes it to the stomach, the acid and the pepsin have nothing to break down, and so they will begin breaking down the walls of the stomach. This is why every doctor will always recommend moderation, not eating too much, but not starving yourself in order to prevent any damage to the stomach, and now you understand why. To test your knowledge of the stomach before we move on to the next series in this series of videos in this series, you can take a look at this case study here that focuses entirely on the effects of this bacterium, Helicobacter pylori, and then after that, take a look at the practice problems below to see if you can test your knowledge of the functions and purpose of the stomach.